Hey everybody, this video is called Bud the Rod, and tonight we're going to continue our pass through here in the book of Numbers, looking at the 17th chapter, where we're going to look at the budding of Aaron's rod. So let's take a look at chapter 17. We'll start verses 1 through 3. And it says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and get from them a rod from each father's house. All their leaders, according to their father's houses, 12 rods. Write each name of the man on his rod, and you shall write Aaron's name on the rod of Levi. For there shall be one rod for the head of each father's household." So, chapter 17 here, it's opening up with a gathering of rods. And what you got to remember as you study through the Bible, anytime that you see the rod, it's going to be a picture or a symbol of authority. And shepherds use a rod to guide and to correct the sheep, as you can find in Psalm 23, verse 4. As you know, the psalmist in 23 said, "Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." And Moses was a shepherd with a rod in hand when he was tending the sheep in the wilderness back in Exodus chapter 4, verse 2. And then later on, you see the rod becomes known as the rod of God, a symbol of authority of God given to Moses. And this rod of his in Exodus 7, it became a serpent and a rod again in that miracle. And Moses' rod turned the waters of the Nile and the blood also in the book of Exodus chapter 7. And it brought a plague of frogs in Exodus chapter 8. And we also know lice. So the rod has been a symbol of the authority. And we saw hail in Exodus 9:23, locusts in 10:13. And God commanded Moses to raise the rod over the Red Sea when it was parted back in Exodus chapter 14, verse 16. And the rod was raised in prayer over Israel in victorious battle in Exodus 17, verse 9. So the book of Exodus has many examples of the rod. And the rod struck the rock and it brought forth water, as you'll see later in chapter 20, verse 11 next week. And the rod is a picture of God's authority over man across the book of Psalms, in Psalm 2, verse 9, Psalm 89, verse 32. And then also the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah 10:24 and Isaiah 11:4. And then also once in the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel 20, verse 37. And Jesus in his divine authority is given the title of rod in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1, and Micah chapter 6, verse 9. So I'm throwing tons of verses at you from the Old Testament. I challenge you to look them up and see for yourself. And in gathering rods and inscribing each with the name of a tribe, and on Levi's rod, inscribing Aaron's name. And God would declare which tribe possessed the priestly authority by choosing one of the rods out of the 12. And this was the issue at hand in light of Korah's rebellion. That's where we left off a couple days ago. In verse 4 and 5, it says, "Then you shall place them in the tabernacle of meeting before the testimony, where I meet with you. And it shall be that the rod of the man whom I choose to blossom will blossom. Thus I will rid myself of the complaints of the children of Israel, which they make against you." So the testimony is the 10 commandments that were written on the two stone tablets that was kept in the Ark of the Covenant. And the phrase "before the testimony" is synonymous with "before the Ark." And "I will rid the murmurings" does not mean that Israel would never complain again. You're going to find, right as we finish through the book of Numbers, that Israel's going to be complaining and complaining, murmuring and murmuring after one another. But it means that God would no longer regard their murmuring. God isn't going to put up with it. And God would judge their murmuring. And complainers have complaining and discontent hearts. That's where complaining comes from, when we have a discontent heart. And it's demonstrated as they complain about one issue after another, and they are never satisfied. I forgot, it might be the Bee Gees or whoever, but ain't got no satisfaction, that song. And verse 6 and 7, it says, so Moses spoke to the children of Israel, and each of their leaders gave them a rod each, a piece. For each leader, according to their fathers' houses, 12 rods, and the rod of Aaron was among their rods. And Moses placed the rods before the Lord in the tabernacle of witness. So we see that the rods are placed before the Lord in the tabernacle of witness. And in verse 8 and 9, now it came to pass on the next day that Moses went into the tabernacle of witness, and behold, the rod of Aaron and of the house of Levi had sprouted and put forth buds, had produced blossoms, and yielded ripe almonds. Then Moses brought out all the rods from before the Lord to all the children of Israel, and they looked, and each man took his rod. So as stated in verse 5, God said that the stick of the man that he had chosen would blossom, and we see that it comes about here with Aaron's stick. And not only did Aaron's stick blossom, but you see the ripe almonds that it yielded. And therefore God exceeded the demands of the test, so that there would be no uncertainty what the will of God was, that he had chosen Aaron to be the high priest. And as the words of the infallible proofs can be found in the book of Acts later, chapter 1, verse 3, God gave many miracles to show his approval of Aaron's leadership. And don't think of God's choice of Aaron's rod means that Aaron was, the most spiritual man in the nation. God does not pick those who seem the most spiritual. And that he didn't pick Aaron because he wouldn't sin or fall significantly. We know Aaron will fall significantly. And it meant that Aaron was God's chosen priest, and that the nation was required to recognize it. And in verse 9, it's a dramatic scene as each murmurer, I love that word, from the different tribe, they took their rod, and they saw that in their hand that it had not budded or bore fruit. Therefore they knew that they were not chosen by God to be the priest. And we know that they knew that Aaron at that point was chosen by God because his rod budded, and it also yielded ripe almonds. In verse 10 and 11, it says, and the Lord said to Moses, bring Aaron's rod back before the testimony to be kept as a sign against the rebels, that you may put their complaints away from me, lest they die. Thus did Moses, just as the Lord had commanded him, so he did. And Aaron's rod that blossomed and brought forth the fruit was to be kept as an indication of God's choice in order to permanently stop the murmuring of the rebellious Israelites. And Aaron's priesthood would always be Aaron's priesthood, and his rod was to be kept in the Ark of the Covenant as another example of Israel's failure in their rebellion. And now, if God demonstrated his choice of Aaron and his descendants as priests for Israel, how can Jesus be our high priest, as Hebrews 2:17 tells us? And Jesus Christ is our high priest of the order of Melchizedek, not of Aaron, as Hebrews 7 tells us. And check out Hebrews chapter 7 there. In verse 12 and 13, wrapping up the chapter, it says, so the children of Israel spoke to Moses, saying, surely we die, we perish, we all perish. Whoever even comes near the tabernacle of the Lord must die. Shall we all utterly die? So finally, the people realized that their sin in challenging Aaron's role, and the people's fear of going near to God led to the reaffirmation of the priesthood of Aaron and his sons as well. And you'll see more of the details of their duties and responsibilities in the very next chapter tomorrow. And after all, they saw God's judgment in the rebellion of Korah when he destroyed Korah and Dathan and Abiram with their 250 minion followers. And their fear doesn't mean that their hearts were changed. Many people are afraid of the consequences. It doesn't mean that their fear meant that their hearts changed, as God has to be the one that changes our hearts. And you'll see that often today, that people don't want to go to hell. They just want to be out of the punishment. They don't want to deal with the consequences and all that. And this won't be the last account of the complaining or the murmuring as mentioned of Israel. So to make a quick wrap up here, to try to cut back a few minutes, because if you saw Saturday's video, it was almost like a whole sermon, 32 minutes. But the key point to note is that God reaffirmed his choice of Aaron, and we saw the gathering of rods identified with each of the tribes. And the rod is also a picture of the apostles' authority you'll find in the New Testament in the church in 1 Corinthians 4:21. And we see the rods were to be placed in the tabernacle of God's choosing. And we see the rods placed before the Lord in the tabernacle of witness. And we saw that Aaron's rod budded. And what we need to gather out of this is that God does not choose sinless, perfect people to be his leaders, but God is taking those who are godly character. He chooses those with godly character as he transforms them into the godly character. And I want to go over to Titus chapter 1, verse 5, starting out through 9. In Titus 1:5 through 9, you're going to see that it's speaking about what are the qualifications for elders in the church. So Titus 1:5, Paul speaking, says, "For this reason I left you in Crete, or Crete, whatever you call it, Crete, I think's the name, that you should set in order the things that are lacking and appoint elders in every city as I commanded you. If a man is blameless, the husband of one wife, having faithful children, not accused of dispensation or insubordination, for a bishop must be blameless as a steward of God, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but hospitable, a lover of what is good and sober-minded, just, holy, self-controlled, holding fast to the faithful word as he has been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and to convict those who contradict." So that is what makes godly leaders in the church. Living a perfect lifestyle, which is not possible for us, doesn't make somebody a leader. And we saw that the command to preserve Aaron's rod in the Ark of the Covenant, as well as we see the reaction and the aftermath of the children of Israel. So that wraps up this video, and we'll see you tomorrow as we're going to look at the laws pertaining to the priests and the Levites. So I hope you have a great rest of your Monday evening, and we'll see you tomorrow night. God bless.